Hello and welcome back to The Scriptures Are Real. I'm your host, or co-host anyway, Lamar, and I have with me Kerry Muhlestein. And we also have a special guest here today. And I could not be happier about this. This was my special request to have this gentleman with us. This is Dr. Daniel Peterson. You've probably read some of his books. Any of you that have been following anything in Deseret Book, he's probably there on some shelf somewhere. And I wanted to talk to him for a long time. I got his address here called Understanding Islam back in 2002 when it first came out. I had friends that were working at Deseret Book, and they lent that to me. And at the time, I was doing a lot of driving between cities for work. And I listened to that, and I was like, man, if people could just get a hold of Dr. Peterson's book or this audio program, they would understand so much more about Islam and why we were having so many problems. Remember, 2002, this is just after 2001, which was the attacks in 9/11 in September. And so this was very new. And I was like, I wish that he would go and keep the LDS version, which is great. I wished also that he would have taken another one and take out LDS references so that the Congress could understand it. And I wanted to send it to every member of Congress just so that they could get an idea of what's going on. So anyway, if I'm not being too effusive here and gushing, this has been my request. When Kerry and I were talking about different topics to go over, I said, do you know Daniel Peterson? He goes, yeah, I know him pretty well, actually. And I was like, can we get him to talk about? So anyway, so today we're going to talk about where Islam comes from. And this kind of follows along with the Come Follow Me. And it falls into Ishmael. So Islam comes from Ishmael. And we're gonna talk about that. And so I've done a lot of talking now. Or let's let Dan do some talking here. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Real excited to have you.
Maybe even before we let him say stuff, I'll just plug some of the other things that he does. So you're recently retired, right, from BYU?
Yeah, July 1st of 2021.
Yeah, so we miss him here, but he writes regular columns for the Deseret News and blogs, and started the Interpreter Foundation, which, if you've not checked that out, you should sometime. Fantastic articles, blogs, all sorts of things. One of the best resources for a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that's outside of what the church produces. It's a fantastic one. So interpreter.org is where you can go for that. And so I don't know of many people who've been more prolific. I mean, he was one of the original founders of FARMS, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. I don't know of someone who has produced more good stuff for members of the church than Dr. Peterson. So I'll also give my welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And if I can add a little commercial to that, one of the things Interpreter did this past year was to do a film called Witnesses about the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And I'm pretty excited because next month no, it's not next month. It's in March. We're going to be premiering a docudrama that extends that coverage from the three witnesses to the 8 and the informal witnesses, and includes interviews with scholars and so on and so forth. So I'm pretty excited about that.
That is exciting.
Great. Yeah.
And I love that movie, by the way. Anyone who's kind of followed me will see that I was pumping it on social media and so on. It's a great movie. So
Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here, and it's a fun topic to talk about because Ishmael tends to get forgotten.
yeah.
Right.
We think of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but there's another kid in there. He's actually Abraham's firstborn son, though he's not born to Sarah. He's not the one through whom the birthright comes and the blessings, but he is given blessings. And if you read the Old Testament carefully, you notice that it's promised that a great nation will spring from him as well as from Isaac. And Abraham, when there's strife in his family between Sarah and Hagar, Abraham is told, don't worry. I mean, your name, your blessing will continue through Isaac, but Ishmael also is going to do all right. And so he is widely considered to be the founder of the Arab nation, if you want to call it that, who are sometimes called in medieval sources Hagarenes or Hagarites, or after Hagar, the mother. And in fact, her name means flight. She's driven out eventually by by Sarah. It's not one of the more pleasant family scenes in the Hebrew Bible or in the scriptures, but she's driven out with her boy. And
is that in Arabic then that it means flight, or?
yes, her name means flight in the Hebrew, but also in Arabic, it's related to the word hijra, which is used for the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina.
All right.
Even today, when they use our calendar, but they also use what they call the Hijri calendar.
Right.
They would say HAJR, but you can see it's related to Hagar, and in Egyptian Arabic it would be HGR.
Yeah, I should have made that connection, because as soon as you say it, I can recognize that connection. But that's fantastic. So
what happens to her is almost already in her name, in a sense.
Yeah.
And so they're driven out, and this becomes really a foundational story for not just Jews and Christians, but for Muslims as well. It was well known in Arabia, apparently. I mean, we don't have pre-Islamic poetry that goes back very far, but we do have some, and some of it already knows the story of Abraham and Ishmael, and knows that the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. I mean, that story was around among Arabs even before the rise of Islam. And they had their own genealogies, taking them back to Ibrahim, as they call him in Arabic,
right.
Abraham, our Abraham. And in fact, when Muslims do the pilgrimage today, they reenact part of the story of Hagar and Ishmael. There's a period where they run back and forth between two hills. This reenacts Hagar's search for water, sort of frantic search for water for the baby Ishmael, when she's afraid that he's going to die. And then you may remember that a spring bubbles up and provides water. The voice of the angel says, "Don't worry, he's not going to die. He's going to be the father of a great nation." And
and she names the spring, "God has seen me," right? Or God sees me, the God that sees me. Yeah,
that's right. Now, the Arabs take it a little differently. They transfer the story from where the Bible puts it, which is around Beersheba in the south of Israel, right on the edge of the Negev desert. And they put it in Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Arabic lore connects Hagar and Abraham too, and Ishmael, with the Kaaba, the shrine that you see in Mecca, the most sacred place in the Islamic world. Many of you have probably seen that image of that big black cubic building in the center of Mecca, towards which everyone prays. Abraham is supposed to, Adam is supposed to have founded it, but Abraham is supposed to have restored it in connection with his son Ishmael, who was there. And the spring that came up is the well of Zamzam, which supplies the water for the city of Mecca. In Islamic lore, but they do know the story. They just put it in a slightly different place.
Right. And that's a fantastic context when you think about our perspective, that God established a covenant with Abraham, but it's renewed with Adam. He establishes the covenant with Adam, but it's renewed with Abraham. And as you mentioned, God's clear. He is establishing a covenant with Ishmael, and it's almost the same. There are a couple differences, but it's not far different from what he's promising Isaac.
No, it isn't. And we tend to forget Ishmael. And, so I sometimes try to remind people of Abraham's other children.
Yeah.
He didn't just have the one family. He has a big other family with 12 princes, as it says in the King James Bible, like the 12 tribes of Israel. So, there's a whole other story there. And Arabic lore preserves a lot of that, probably sometimes in distorted ways, but to a large degree, they've kept it, and they remember it, and they see themselves as children of Abraham, and they refer, just as the Bible does, to Abraham as the friend of God.
Yeah. Khalil, right? Is that the Arabic word, Khalil?
So you go to Hebron, where Abraham is buried traditionally, and it's often known as El Khalil, just the friend. In other words, the place of the friend of God.
Yeah. Or if you go to the big bazaar in Cairo, it's called Khan al-Khalili, right? The bazaar of the friend, which it means Abraham's bazaar.
Yeah, it comes from the same, that is the name. You don't have to call him Abraham in Arabic. Just say El-Khalil, and they know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Unless it's a particular modern guy named Khalil, you might have a friend named Khalil. But Al-Khalil in the religious sense is Abraham. He is God's friend. So he's really, really important in Islamic thinking. And he's considered a Muslim, small m. Um, and what does Muslim mean? Muslim means a submitter, one who submits. And Islam means submission to the will of God. And the story they tell to illustrate Abraham's great willingness to submit to the will of God is the story of his near sacrifice of his son. That even though he'd yearned for the son for decades, when he finally got him and he was told, you have to go sacrifice him, he was willing to do it, not happy about it. You know, some traditions make the son, Isaac, usually in the Jewish and Christian tradition, in his teens or something. I've sometimes wondered how big a sacrifice that was. Some of you raised teenagers, you might think, really? Really? I get to do it, man. I've been tempted so many times, but he's regarded as a great figure, and Abraham is seen as submitting to God because he doesn't want to do this. It goes against everything. You know, we know that he escaped an area where they did human sacrifice. He thought he was getting away from that. And then this son is so important to him, and he's asked to do it. And he's willing to do it, and for that, because he exercises faith, that he trusts God even though he doesn't get it, then he's rewarded as being the father of the faithful and the friend of God. And by the way, let me say something else about that. A lot of people who know anything about Islam and about Arab views on this will say, well, but the Muslims believe that it was Ishmael, not Isaac, who was nearly sacrificed by Abraham. Right. And that's probably true today. I think it's a matter of ethnic pride, especially because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It wasn't their guy, it was our guy. He's the one that God chose. But actually, the Quran never names the son that is about to be sacrificed by Abraham. It merely says that he nearly sacrificed Ibnahu, his son.
Oh, yeah.
And then I mentioned this once in a class many years ago when I was first teaching at BYU. And I had a couple of Palestinian students sitting on the front row. I think that they took the class because they thought they'd get an easy A. When they got their first D on a test, I think they learned their mistake. But just growing up there doesn't necessarily fill you with knowledge. But one of them challenged me. He said, "That's not true. The Quran does name the son." I said, "Okay, you find me the passage." Well, he came back and admitted there isn't any. It never names him. And so I did a spot check once on the standard commentaries, the classical commentaries, and I can say up through, 925, 930 AD, opinions were almost precisely divided among Muslim commentators as to whether it was Ishmael or Isaac. Now, I say today, it's everybody in the Arab world would say, no, Ishmael. But there's no basis for that in the text.
So, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
I've often wondered, I wanted to ask somebody who would know the answer. How do the Muslims see this story of the sacrifice? I mean,
they see it as a test of Abraham. The test.
So they do recognize this was a thing that happened. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a test of Abraham. Will you obey God even when he asks you to do something that you loathe? And the answer was yes, that he would. Now, there are some explanations, and these run across Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources. Some say, well, part of the reason he was able to do it in faith was he assumed that if he had to sacrifice his son, God would restore his son to him. I mean, when in Genesis, when Abraham leaves the servants and takes the boy with him, he says, "We'll be back." Basically, he says, "We'll return to you in a few days," and that's either a lie, because he knows his son isn't coming back, or it's an expression, as many of the commentators said, that whatever he's asked to do, he's confident that the covenant son will come back with him.
Oh, interesting.
And that plays a little bit into that idea of, well, God will provide when they ask, what's the sacrifice? God will provide, and many people have thought he's still wrestling through in his mind at that moment. How does this work when I've been promised this son, but I'm killing this son? There's got to be something going on here.
Yeah. And the fact is that what he shows is that he's willing to obey, even though he doesn't understand it. he still trusts God. He trusts that somehow all the promises that he's been given about how he'll be the father of a great nation, he's getting a little past his prime. By this point, he doesn't have too many more options. And now you're asked to kill your son, right? He says, no, somehow this is all going to work out. I just don't know how. So Muslims would say, yes, it's a test. Now, Muslims don't believe in the deity of Christ. That's the fundamental difference between Islam and Christianity. They're more like Judaism in that score. So they don't see in Abraham's near sacrifice of his son, a symbolic prefiguring of God's giving his son as a sacrifice. But from a Christian point of view, we're the ones who are about to pay the price, and then a ram is caught in the thicket, sacrificed on our behalf, the Lamb of God.
Well, so I have a question. So the second part of that question is, do they recognize the story of the sacrifice? We would say Isaac, but you say it could be Ishmael. Okay. So the second part of that is, then what did they say about the birthright? Do they agree the birthright did not go? Because I'm sure they wouldn't say that. They wouldn't say, well, no, the birthright went to Isaac. So what do they say about that?
No, they tend to regard both of them as prophets.
Okay.
Not just patriarchs, but as prophets. And so they each have a different calling. And yes, many of the prophets, and they'll recognize that line, come through Isaac. But a prophet was also, and the greatest of all, they would say, the last of them all, the Chetem and Nebiyin, the seal of the prophets, is to come through the line of Ishmael. But this is all part of God's plan. So both Ishmael and Isaac have important roles in the divine economy, if you will.
Well, I didn't know if they had their own version, like, no, the birthright should have really gone to us. And I'm noticing all the parallels that you're talking about. You're talking about how they have 12 princes, which is similar to the 12 tribes. And what was the name of the spring that you talked about? Zamzam?
Yeah, in Mecca, there's a spring called Zamzam. But the story told about her, Hagar, running around looking for water and then going some distance off and saying, I just can't watch it. My son's going to die. I can't watch this. And then the voice of the angel comes and says, don't worry about him. And a spring comes up. This is all told in Islamic sources about Mecca.
Right. Well, and you think about, okay, so the Gihon Springs in Jerusalem is, all these stories have very similar parallels, the 12 this and the spring that, and the stories are similar but told in a different respect. So anyway, that's kind of what I was getting at. So, and
of course, if you've traveled in the Middle East at all, or frankly, if you've traveled in the American Southwest, you can understand that water is really, really important.
Oh,
when
yeah.
Spring comes up, that's really important.
Sure.
So I have a further question. Oh, sorry. Further question about that, if it's okay. And I just want to say, I spend lots of time in Egypt. I have lots of Muslim friends that are Palestinian and that are Egyptian. And so there are some things that I talk with them about and some things I understand, but some things I just really don't get. So I'm going to ask you one of these questions. So you've talked about the tradition that the well that Hagar sees is there in Mecca, where they're saved. Does that then reposition the story of where Abraham is for them, or is Abraham still in what we would call the Negev area, and Hagar just went a really long ways before she had this problem?
Well, when Ishmael is described, he's described as sort of ranging over a pretty big area from not too far away from Beersheba. I'm trying to remember the town that's mentioned, but it's from there all the way over in the direction of Assyria, it says.
Right.
So he's covering vast territories. The idea is he's the nomad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so he gets around. And, I don't know that most nomads really generally traveled such vast distances, but he, according to the Muslim view, did. And Abraham did as well. So he moves across the deserts in remarkable ways. And nomads are very proud of that sort of thing, that they're mobile. I still remember many years ago, my first time in the Middle East. I found myself, for some reason, I don't know why, I was down toward I was in the Sinai, I think, and I was standing alone. Nobody else was around me, no other students or anything. And I was standing by a Bedouin who was sitting on a camel, and I didn't know what to say. It's just the two of us standing there for a fair amount of time. And so I finally said something to him about, you must be really happy to be back under Egyptian rule. because they'd just come back under the control.
Oh, right. Right.
And he said, I am Bedouin. And what he meant by that, in effect, was, I don't care.
Doesn't matter to me.
You know, Egyptian, Israeli, I never paid attention to the Israelis. I don't intend to pay attention to the Egyptians. These national boundaries and nation states are irrelevant to me. I'm mobile. I move around.
Yeah. And I have lots of friends as well who are Bedou or Bedouin, right? That and that's exactly, even as they become sedentary, they are, and more of them are, but they are very, very proud of that heritage, and they feel like they are a people apart.
Yeah.
Like, you can have your rules and your boundaries and whatever. We just do what we do.
Yeah.
And they do look to Ishmael for that heritage, has been my impression.
They do. In the old days, well, I mean, the way they look at it is they are free in a way that people who are rooted to the land and subject to taxes are not.
Yeah.
They're slaves. We're free. And we can move around. There's a political story that really sort of illustrates this for me. You know, at one point for 3 years, 58 to 61, Egypt and Syria were one country, the United Arab Republic. And at one point, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the head of Egypt, and therefore the head of the whole thing at that point, came over and visited Damascus. And he was a socialist, heavily influenced by Marxism. And he looked around Syria and he said, this place is, it's just wrong. There aren't enough bureaucrats here to man a grocery store. I thought it was really funny that he thought a lack of bureaucrats was a bad thing. He thought we needed a lot of bureaucrats to run a grocery store. But the Syrians, in response, basically broke up with Egypt because they saw the Egyptians as a nation of slaves under the pharaoh, always. That pharaoh just happened to be Gamal Abdel Nasser. But it had always been a pharaoh, and then the scribes and bureaucrats, and then the serfs and peasants. But the Syrians, they were Bedouins, nomads, and you couldn't enslave them that way. Kind of natural born anarchists, and they were thinking about it. So, you know,
wandering Arameans.
We are the real Arabs, they thought, and it was true that in, well, for example, in Muhammad's time, the 7th century. Any family that could afford it would send their son. I don't think they did it with daughters, but they'd send their son out for a year or two among the Bedouin to learn the real Arab ways. Sort of like, you know, in Europe at a certain point, sending your kid from England to take the grand tour of the continent, you know, pick up a smattering of French and all that sort of thing. For them, send them out to live among the Bedouins, because the Bedouins are the real Arabs. We who live in cities are not. I mean, we're sort of Arabs, but they're the real Arabs. In fact, in the Quran, the word Arab only really refers to the Bedouin. They were the real ones.
Yeah.
So,
and I have to admit that your statement about bureaucracy in Egypt maybe is still true. There's a lot of bureaucracy, but
you've had that experience. Some of us have. There's a big building right on Tahrir Square in Cairo called the Mogama. Mm-hmm. You may have spent some time there.
Oh yeah.
I'd like to say I spent a year there 1 week. It's a funny story if you have a minute. You can always cut it out if you don't. But when I first went over to Egypt, I applied for a visa with the Egyptian consulate in San Francisco, and no response at all. And so finally I had to drive from Los Angeles. It was getting time for me to go. I had to drive from LA to San Francisco to get my visa stamped, or my passport stamped. And I had a 3-month visa, or so I thought. So I get over there, and after about a month and a half, I thought, well, this is probably going to be a nightmare. I better get the visa renewed. I take it into the Mogama, that big, huge building there on the main square in Cairo. And they said, you're here illegally. This is a 1-month visa, not a 3-month visa.
Oh, no.
How am I supposed to know? Well, the 1-month visa was triangular. This one's oval. How am I supposed to know that? I went in every day for a full week, getting shunted from office to office, until one day the fellow was just telling me, look, you criminal Westerners, you think you can ignore our laws? You're going to prison. And I thought, I'll just take my risks rather than that. I was lamenting that in the evening to an Egyptian friend of mine, married to the Relief Society president. He said, I've got tomorrow off. I'll come and help you. And he said, just bring some £1 notes, which are only worth a few cents. And we went from office to office. I'm here confessing this on a podcast, bribing officials in that building from one room to another. We got to the last guy who'd been threatening me with prison the previous day. And he said, oh, he takes a £1 note. He said, oh, let me see your passport. Oh, this wasn't your mistake. This was our mistake. And he immediately gave me the new stamp. And I thought, for one Egyptian pound.
Wow.
But, the bureaucracy there is just, it is unbelievable. And it's been that way since ancient times.
Yeah.
There's always been that scribal class, and they've just grown into it. That's what they expect, but it's not the Bedouin spirit. I mean, Egypt is very different.
Yeah.
An Arab is not an Arab is not an Arab. They're different from place to place. And, there's some commonalities, but some differences. And that's one. There's a wonderful film. Then I'll stop this, but there was a wonderful film that came out years ago called Irhab wa Kebab, Terrorism and Kebab. And it was about a fellow who goes into the Mugama and he gets so frustrated. It's a comedy, don't worry. He gets so frustrated, he grabs a gun of one of the guards and takes over the building, and people throughout the building join in the rebellion. People are outside applauding on the streets. And I thought, I love this movie. If I had been there, I would have joined. So,
I'm just going to remain silent on this whole using pound notes to get things to happen. I have nothing to say about that.
But the Arab spirit is one of the Bedouin spirit is one of freedom, and if the sheikh of your tribe is oppressive, he wakes up the next morning and the tribe has moved, and he's all alone. So there's a reason why the sheikh has to. Yes, he kind of guides the tribe, but he also has to keep their favor. There's a mutual relationship here, which isn't true under dictatorships and that sort of thing. So
that was one of the interesting things I took away from understanding Islam, was how different the mindset is among the people. I mean, I know in the West, we get so used to the idea of a democracy, and we have a voice, and there's judges, and these people do this and these people do that. And we don't have an idea of what true tribalism looks like.
Yeah.
And how that tribal mentality is everything. And it was, even though, again, I understood who Ishmael was, but it didn't make the connection. So I was listening to your audio lecture there. And then the same thing with the way, that's true. If for thousands of years you've lived with the tribal idea, or your sheikh or your imam or whatever, that's your go-to guy. He tells you what to think or what to do, and they don't have any concept of, well, let's get together and talk about ideas, and let's let the best ideas come to the top, and let's have, Socrates and Plato. They have no concept of any of this kind of stuff. And it's just really hit home.
In the Middle East, in the Arab world, certainly, it's personal relationships that count.
Mm-hmm.
When a president dies and a vice president takes his place, they have constitutions and all that kind of thing, but it's really a matter of whether the new guy can forge those relationships, or whether he has those relationships. They're much more about personal status than about contract, much more about relationships than about, prescribed patterns and that sort of thing. They do believe in discussion. They'll have often pretty spirited ones. In fact, when I first went to the Middle East, I'd see them yelling and the hands just flying and all this sort of thing. And I'd think, oh my word, they're about to kill each other. And then one of them would slap the other on the back and they'd go off laughing. And so it's a very much a Mediterranean culture with a lot of, like the Italians to the north and so on, a lot of hand motions and that sort of thing. And I suspect it always was. This staid image of the Egyptians that we have from tomb paintings probably didn't reflect daily life of, loud discussions in the marketplace. And Cairo is still wide awake at 2 a.m. Everybody's out on the streets talking, because they take siestas during the daytime. It's too hot.
Right.
But, they love those sorts of discussions, and they do believe in what they call shura, or councils. But what you have throughout the Middle East right now are often military dictatorships and so on, that if they're not military now, they are at root. So
can you kind of bridge the gap? I'm sorry, Kerry, do you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, I was going to ask
Go
just
ahead.
a little bit more about the tribalism thing, but
Yeah. No,
so-
go ahead. Go to tribalism, but I want to throw in about something about bridging the gap between here and there. But go ahead.
Yeah. So, and this is one of the things, and it was actually my interactions with people in Jordan, that where as I came to understand their life a little bit better, and there's still a lot of real tribal affiliation and loyalty in Jordan, more so than in Egypt. Egypt hasn't been as much tribal, but it was in seeing that in modern days that I suddenly connected with some things in the Bible that made sense to me in the Old Testament. So, and I think if we can understand this, it will help us understand the period of, well, a little bit of Jacob's family, but especially the period of the judges and that transition into kingship. And it's a long time before, well, and you still can see tribal elements throughout all of their history, but it's a long time before it's not like really deeply permeated by tribalism. But I think that's something that's difficult for us to understand. But someone who deals with Ishmael's descendants, as it were, where tribalism is even more rooted, I would say. So since you're so familiar with that, maybe you could help us understand some of that. I think it will make both that area of the modern world and an aspect of the scriptural world more real for us.
Yeah. The fact is we take for granted certain attitudes about, rights and organization of government and so on and so forth. But it took us a long time to get here. You can go back to Magna Carta in the early Middle Ages. It was a long evolution in the English-speaking world.
Oh, yeah.
To something like the U.S. Constitution. And even then, we entered into the beginning of our country with the women unable to vote and slaves. I mean, it has been a long, if you will,
refining process. Yeah.
So we sometimes go into countries that haven't gone through any of that process and are mystified. Well, why haven't they become just, American-style democracies overnight? Because we didn't.
Right.
It takes a while to develop those habits and to recognize those things. I mean, I'm struck by a line from, if I recall correctly, Robert E. Lee, who, when he decided finally, he was offered the commander position of the Union armies, but he finally went with the Confederacy because he said he had to be loyal to his country, by which he meant Virginia.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. I mean, it took us a while to even get that notion. I've always wanted to do a study. When did we start saying the United States has and the United States is? It used to be the United States are and the United States have. And I'm kind of suspecting that happened around the end of the Civil War, something like that. We finally began thinking of a unitary government rather than a bunch of pretty much independent states where the southern states thought, well, we can leave. You don't have to stay. Well, we've changed our attitude on that now. But this whole idea of overcoming tribalism, it takes a long time to get there. And the Middle East has been, in that tribal position, many parts of it. As you say, Egypt, not so much. Egypt has been a state since,
before any other states ever thought of being a state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, you go back to before the pyramids and you had a state there in Egypt. And but that wasn't true in Jordan. Jordan is still fundamentally a kind of Bedouin state in a way.
And I also want to emphasize that, while we say you're kind of overcoming and progressing, but there are some wonderful, beautiful elements of this kind of family loyalty that is associated with tribalism. So I think that's worth pointing out as well. But.
No, it's. I don't want to say it's all negative at all, because it isn't. The hospitality of Arab families, their loyalty to one another is astonishing. And there's a marvelous section in a movie that was done years ago about Hugh Nibley called The Faith of an Observer. And I think there may be a nice cleaned up version of it online somewhere. I don't remember where. I think it was just put up within the past few months. And at the end, he tells the story of a Jewish midrashic version of Abraham's story of entertaining the angels. And he's out there in the desert on a bitterly hot day in the desert, looking for a traveler to whom he can offer hospitality. And he's vowed basically that he won't eat until he can share his meal. And then these three strangers come along who turn out to be the Lord and two angels, who then give him the promise of his son. But But that hospitality, that attitude of the Arab sheikh, I see it in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, so well illustrated. And even today, the greeting that you hear in Arabic, you've heard it if you've traveled around the Arab world at all, they'll say ahlan wa sahlan, which is welcome or hello. Well, what it literally means, ahl is kinfolk, and sahel is a level place. What it's saying is you've reached family and a level campground. This is a Bedouin greeting. I don't think the Arabs even remember, what the context of it is, but you're saying you've been traveling through the desert. Now you're among kin, and even if they're not, and this is a good place to camp, stay with us. So in these stories in Genesis, when Abraham goes out and meets the strangers, he begs them to come in under his roof. And then when they go to visit Lot, even Lot begs them to come in under his roof and accept his hospitality. This is so Bedouin and that's still alive as a really important thing today. I've been in homes where they've fed me and fed me and fed me till I couldn't eat anymore, and then they fed me some more, and it's, don't you like our food? Yes, then have another 3. And that sort of thing. It can sometimes get out of control, but it's that Arab heritage that I see in the Old Testament among the patriarchs.
We went to a great Arab restaurant in Jerusalem, and they have those salads they bring out. And my brother-in-law was telling me, "Oh, they'll bring these salads." I'm thinking some tossed green salad. No, it was 14 little dishes of like 3 different kinds of hummus, and there was like several different kinds of cabbage, and just the 14 different plates of all that. And of course, we had a couple people there, so we had 28 plates. And that was before the kebabs came out. And I was like, man, I'm never leaving this place. The food and everything and the hospitality was so good. They were really nice people. I really liked them a lot. And again, going back to I had just a better understanding. Listen to what you were talking about. I mean, we talk about, the Muslims, they hate us. Really? Do they? Do they really hate you? Or is someone telling you that? Or where are you getting that from? Where do we get this from? And I want to ask you that in the end about what we want to do. But I want to piggyback on what Kerry was just saying. I want to talk about how we get we have Ishmael and Hagar. They're chased out in the desert. Like you said, it's not a happy family moment from Sarah chased them out. So we have a period of, I don't know, what is that, like 2,700 years or so, where they're in the desert. And so kind of bridge the gap. What happens after they sort of leave the scene? We have times when the Arabs come in and out of the Old Testament. But as a student reading Come Follow Me, we have Hagar, we have Ishmael, and he's not going to be the birthright son. He's chased out. And then we don't hear about a lot of what happens. So can you bridge for us what happens between that period and then when Muhammad comes in the 7th century? Where are these guys going? What happens, and how do they get to where they are? And then we'll talk about, modern stuff.
Yeah, they're living out in the desert. Now, I think one way of looking at the biblical account is it's a lineage history. John Sorensen developed that idea with reference to the Book of Mormon. You have a pretty comprehensive history of the Nephites, but if you tried to construct a history of the Lamanites from the Book of Mormon, you couldn't do it. There are too many gaps.
Right.
They only figure when they impinge upon the Nephite story. Likewise, the Arabs only really figure in the Hebrew Bible when they have some sort of effect upon the Israelites, which is relatively rare. The people of Esau and Ishmael, the Ishmaelites. I mean, you have it in the story of Joseph, and my word, I'm almost slipping into rhymes and rhythms from Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreams. I think of Ishmaelites, and that takes me right into a song, which I won't do.
It's going to be a musical podcast. We don't know.
Yeah. But they're out there and they're trading, and you see them show up in history occasionally. For example, in the story of Paul, when Paul goes out and he hides among the Arabs in Arabia, that's probably the area around Petra. Which was the Nabateans were an Arab group. And so Aretas, who is mentioned in the New Testament, that's just the Arabic name Harith. which is still occasionally heard in the Arab world still today. And there were a whole series of kings named Aretas or Harith in the Arab form there, or Zenobia of Palmyra, who takes on the Romans in the 3rd century. That's a Roman form of her name, which is Zainab, which is still a common woman's name in the Arab world today. I know several Zainabs who have met them. So they're still out there, but they're on the fringes. They're usually a little behind or beyond Roman control, or beyond. They do trading between the Romans or their successors, the Byzantines, and other places. But they're kind of on the edges of history. They will sometimes show up as mercenary soldiers fighting for the Persian Empire or fighting for the Byzantine Greco-Roman Empire. And then they erupt into history with Muhammad in the 7th century.
Well, do we mostly think about them? Oh, go ahead, Kerry.
I was just going to say, Isaiah mentions them a few times when he's in his chapters where he's showing that God is going to have dealings with everyone. Yeah. The Arabs are included in that. They're part of the everyone that the Israelites know. And I think your point is important. I mean, really, when we're looking at the scriptures, and you get this even from early on in the book of Moses, where it says the record is kept of Adam's family, basically, you're looking at family histories. That's the scriptures are family histories. And so we have the family history, Isaac's family history. Well, not even all of Isaac's, just Jacob's family history. There's another family history somewhere of Ishmael that I look forward to and hope that we'll get one day. But they're more than just kind of, the peripheral. I mean, in a way they're peripheral, but in a way they're not, because the biblical writers have this keen sense that there is a relation, right? So anyone who's Esau, Moab, the descendants of Abraham's wife, Keturah, or of Ishmael, if they're a descendant of Abraham, they have a special place in the view of the Israelites that's different than anyone who's not a descendant of Abraham.
Right. They're relatives. They're seen as relatives.
And that ties into that tribalism thing, that you may fight them, but at the same time, they are family, and you view them differently and you interact with them differently. Yeah.
I mean, in fact, the word Hebrew and the word Arab may actually come from the same root ultimately. I mean, there's some debate about the origin of Hebrew, but that's a possibility. And I mean, they're all over the place if you pay attention. If you notice, even among the crowd who hear Peter and the apostles speaking in tongues, there were Arabians in that group. I mean, they're always there because, anyone who's been to Jerusalem and on a clear night gone up onto the Mount of Olives and so on, you can see the glow of the city of Amman, the capital of Jordan. You can see it reflected on the clouds above it. It's not that far away.
Yeah.
And so the land of the Arabs, which began just across the Jordan River, was not that far. They were always interacting. I mean, even in the movie Ben-Hur, pure fiction, of course, but not impossible that the guy who has the horses that recruits Ben-Hur to race them in the chariot races in Jerusalem, he's an Arab.
Yeah.
And the fact is, that's not an unrealistic scenario in a way.
Well, how real is it to me that this fits right into what it says in Genesis 16, where it calls Ishmael, he will be a wild man.
Yeah.
Well, he's just that he is. He's we picture this 2,700 years as basically a Bedouin kind of people that move around from place to place. They don't go very far. They're still in that same range, but they are mostly a nomadic people.
Yeah.
They live in on the wild. So they're a wild man. So again, I kind of picture this like, I see this great big picture, and it becomes a little more clear. Someone wipes a little more sand away, and I'm like, oh, that's what it means, a wild man. He's a wild man. All this 2,700 years before, that's when Muhammad comes around, but before they become big players on the world stage with the Ottoman Empire and so forth, they're around the periphery. They interact with people. They come in and out, but they're mostly kind of like a Bedouin society that moves around from place to place, and then later on they'll start warring and they'll settle in certain areas. But that's kind of what I'm taking away. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. When it says he's a wild man, I think it doesn't mean he's nuts or you
No, exactly.
It means he lives in the wilderness.
He's Grizzly Adams, unlike what you're looking like.
But and they moved around from place to place. That's exactly right. I remember when I first began studying Arabic, The very first dialogue that we learned, the very first text that we studied, said, I'll give it to you in Arabic because for some bizarre reason I can still remember it. It's talking about the Bedouin, and it said, يرحلون من مكان إلى مكان بحثا عن الماء. They move from place to place searching for water. And you just said they moved from place to place, and I immediately thought of that line.
Oh yeah.
That is what they did, and what they still do to some extent. I mean, nowadays it's kind of disappointing. I've taken students out to visit Bedouin encampments, and when I get close and I realize that there's a television antenna coming out of the Bedouin tent, and the guy comes out, he's got a Mercedes, and he's wearing an eyes-on shirt. You know, I think, okay, things have changed here a bit, but still, that attitude that we're free, and if the government comes after us too much, we'll simply move. You know, that's still there, and moving from place to place. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to. That's the gap I wanted to bridge, because that's what we get from Genesis in 16, 17, and then Hagar is chased out and they live out there. And then, like I said, we have little snippets that we were talking about, Kerry, they come in and out. But what happens to them? And that's what we get. They're out there, they're kind of living on the wild, but then now we focus on Isaac and Jacob, and then Israel, and then, you know, all that stuff. But just to connect it in my mind, to make those scriptures real. Where do these people go? That's where they go. And now they're going to re-enter the scene again later on in the 7th century when Muhammad comes about, and that formulates them, that unites the tribes, and then they become a kind of a force on the world stage. I mean, with the Ottoman Empire and so forth, they become traders and scientists and everything else that happens in the 7th century on. So maybe can you hit just kind of what happens? So maybe give us just a little brief on what happens to them in the 7th century, how they now formulate, changes them up a little bit, and then we become a world power. And then we'll talk a little bit about, if I can ask that question, and we'll talk about how they are today and what we take away.
Yeah, there were some changes that occurred in probably the late 6th century, beginning of the 7th century, that I think we can sort of detect or read between the lines and see. There were caravan traders that were going up and down the coast of Arabia, and had been for quite some time. I think that Lehi follows one of those trails pretty much along the way, and then he deviates at the end to avoid Yemen, because he's afraid that he might end up leaving Laman and Lemuel there. They might just stay in the flesh pots of Yemen, which, by the way, from my distance, not being their father, I think, would that have been so bad? In Yemen and just carry on. But he avoids Yemen, goes around behind it to the area where he builds the boat and sails for the New World, following, I think, pretty much the old frankincense trail. But somewhere about 3 generations before Muhammad, maybe less, someone in Arabia got the idea, you know, for years we have been making money by serving as guides, or frankly charging protection money. It's kind of a racket. You know, your heavily laden caravan is out here in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Sure would be a pity if something were to happen to it. So you know, if you pay us a certain amount, we can make sure that nothing does. But also, you know, people couldn't maneuver. We talk about the trail. It wasn't a trail like the John Muir Trail or the Appalachian Trail. It was a broad area, sometimes 20, 30 miles wide, and you had to know where the watering holes were. And if you didn't, you died. And so you needed local knowledge, and these people would rent themselves out. Well, somebody finally says, you know what? We could just do this. I mean, they can't function without us. We've been watching this for generations. Why don't we take over the caravan trade for ourselves, eliminate the other guys and just do it ourselves? So by the time Muhammad comes along, most accounts say that he served as a caravan merchant in his early life and had that experience, visited Syria and so on. But what this means is that some ideas are entering into the Arab world. They have apostatized from whatever Ishmael knew, and they still believe in a God by the name of Allah. They call him Allah, A-L-L-A-H, which is, by the way, related to the word Elohim, same root. But they believe in this God, but they've, you know, some other things have you know, like things that fasten onto a boat's hull. You know, it's picked up some baggage, and so something needs to happen to purify their religion, but they have a lot of the basic ideas. They believe there is a supreme God named Allah. They just think he has some daughters and there are some other things. They have some idols in the area. But ideas begin to come in from the outside about Christianity and Zoroastrianism, which was another advanced sort of monotheistic religion in Persia, and Judaism. There are some Jews now in Arabia, probably fleeing the destruction of Jerusalem, either the first temple or the second temple, or both. And they brought some ideas in, and some sensitive souls are saying, well, that's a better religion than this pagan thing that we have, which makes no moral demands. We're getting rich, but it doesn't tell us how to spend our money. If you're really, really rich, go ahead and exploit the poor. Don't care for the widows and the orphans. The gods, the jinn, the genies, they don't care. But there are religions out there with a moral code, and we wish we had something like that. So there's an expectation, I think, about Muhammad's time. There's a kind of movement that are called the Hunafa, or singular Hanif movement, who are looking for a better religion. They're wondering why the Arabs don't have a revelation.
So what does Hanif mean?
Hanif, Abraham is described as a Hanif, a person who is not Jewish, not Muslim, not Christian, because Abraham's earlier than all of those divisions. It's
Right.
sort of, I call it a generic monotheist.
Okay.
That's how I would define it, I think.
Is the modern name Hanafi related to that at all, or is that
It's
different?
related to the root, yeah. It's
Okay.
the name of a legal school, yeah, from a man by the name of Abu Hanifa, but it is from the same root. But they're looking for something better, sort of like the attitude I think you see in the American Northeast. Wilford Woodruff offers the clearest example. There's a guy that he grew up with, Robert Wood, I think was his name. I can't remember his last name. I think it was Wood. And I should have looked it up, but I didn't know I was going to be thinking about it. So
we don't know where it's going to go. So
he refers to him as a prophet because this Robert Wood was older than he was, and said, he was looking for the true religion. It's not on the earth. But he said, Wilfred, it will be someday, and you're going to play a role in it. Wilford Woodruff always refers to him as a prophet after that. And he died before the church was established, or right after. He didn't have a chance to join. And I get the sense that there was something like that in Arabia, people looking for something better. Muhammad is one of them. And so Muhammad is out on a hillside above Mecca, near a cave on Mount Hira, and he's meditating. Actually, we don't know what he's doing. I think I have mentioned this elsewhere, that he's practicing tahanuth, which is really mystifying because, as far as I know, that word occurs only once in all of Arabic writing. So your guess is as good as mine what it means. We can't tell. He's up in the mountain doing tahanuth. Great. I would guess prayer and meditation or something like that. That fits the context. And that's when the revelation of the Quran begins. The angel Gabriel, according to traditional accounts, appears to him and begins revealing the surahs or chapters of the Quran, which extends over 22 years. Now, there is actually an alternate version of that prophetic call, which I really like. From a Latter-day Saint point of view, it's very attractive. From a later Muslim view, not so much. They're too honest to suppress it, but they put it sort of in the footnotes and are mystified by it. According to that version, he's up in the year 610 at the cave of Hira, and he's been meditating or whatever he's doing. And he comes out, nothing has happened. He comes out and he's walking along the brow of the hill. And then he says, I saw him seated upon his throne. And this is clearly not Gabriel. Gabriel is never associated with a throne.
Yeah.
God is. And he seems to be having a vision, according to those accounts, of an anthropomorphic, corporeal, embodied, human-formed God seated upon a throne who calls him to be a prophet. It's a throne theophany vision. Lehi had one very similar to it. And I'm thinking, looking at that, I wonder if he really did, and that this has been suppressed later on. You can see marks of it being suppressed in the documents. They'll say, well, I was walking along and it says in Arabic, "Fara'aytuhu," I saw him, but it doesn't identify him. And I think, come on, tell us the full story. Or the one I really like is, I looked up, "Fara'aytu shay'an." I looked up and I saw a thing, or I saw something. Now, nobody tells a story like that. Nobody says, wow, I was walking along and I looked out the window and I saw something, and then move on. Don't elaborate on what you saw. So somebody's tinkered with the text at that point, I think, because later Islam doesn't like the idea of an anthropomorphic deity in the form of a human being. But I think that's what Muhammad thought he saw. And so that begins his prophetic career from 610 until his death in 632. But the pivotal moment, and Muslims reckon their calendar from this, is the year 622, a little past midway in that 22-year period, where he has to flee his hometown because of persecution, the persecution of his followers, and he leads them to Medina. Well, the town is called Yathrib then. Afterwards, it's called El Medina, the city, or Medinat an-Nabi, the city of the prophet. And that then becomes the headquarters. And there he takes on a political role. And everything about the Islamic Empire flows from that they need him in Medina because they're having strife. They say, look, you're being persecuted in your hometown. Come to our town. You're not related to anybody here, but you have a reputation for integrity. You can be the arbiter of disputes. He's okay, as long as my followers can come with me. Oh, yeah. And as long as you recognize me as the prophet of God. They say, oh, yeah, they're pagans. They don't know what that means. Sure, no problem. What's a fateful decision? Because then he becomes head of both, if you will, church and state, the judge, the supreme ruler. And that's the birth of the Islamic State, which flows from that and eventually filled up much of the Mediterranean basin and all the way over into northern India and so on.
Yeah, 1 billion followers, right? One of the biggest religion on earth right now, as far as organized religions, the biggest one.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I appreciate that. That's all that's fascinating, and trying to lay this out he has beginnings all the way back in the Bible to today. And why are we fighting against ourselves? All these thousands of years later, why are we still fighting?
Well, civil wars can be some of the worst. Conflicts within families can be some of the most bitter. And I guess that's it. I mean, I will tell you, sometimes when I'm driving through the streets of Jerusalem, when I see people walking along, unless they're dressed in peculiar garb, wearing a kippah or, something like that, I can't tell whether they're Arabs or Israelis. Now, some Israelis are very fair-skinned. Obviously, they're Europeans, but many are not. And there was a hotel in particular that we stayed in once years ago with a group of people, and it was jointly operated in Nazareth by Palestinians and Israelis. And I would walk up to the desk. I remember the first night I thought it was a Palestinian, and I said salam, and he said shalom.
Oh,
sorry. Next time I walk up and there's a girl behind the counter, and I said shalom to her, and she said salam. I said, okay, from now on it's hello, because I cannot tell. And I've been around this area a long time. And I'm told by some that if you do DNA testing on at least large percentages of the Arabs and the Israelis, they're very hard to tell apart, even genetically.
Oh, yeah. When you're in Jerusalem itself, in the old city, right there in the walls, it's hard to tell what shopkeepers are doing what. There's a few telltale signs that you can tell, but a lot of times you can't tell who's who, and you're just buying some spice from this one or that one, so hard to tell.
So, that's the irony of it. The really sad thing about the dispute is they're so like each other. And of all the Arab societies, I'd say in some ways the Palestinians are the most like the Israelis, is people have, there have been conspiracy theories about it, but, the sort of Jewish merchants all over the place, really successful, and with a network of international people, the Jewish diamond merchants in Antwerp and Tel Aviv and New York and so on. They're all cousins and that kind of thing. Well, now you're starting to see Palestinian networks exactly like that, because you want to know another really good Levantine mercantile people, the Palestinians. They're really good at it and have been forever. And so it's just, in so many ways, the Israelis and the Palestinians are so similar that it's sad to see the dispute.
Well, exactly. And this is kind of where I want to, my last question, because I know we don't want to take your entire day. And Kerry, if you need to jump in here, please, what I want to do now is, at the end of your understanding Islam and LDS perspective, when I got to the end of that, I was like, how do I reach out to my Muslim brothers now? I don't know any in our neighbor. I mean, there's some in our neighborhood, but what do we take away now? What kind of attitudes? Because if you listen to the media, it's like, well, they're all there. Well, they don't say they're all terrorists, but they're terrorists, and they hate you, and they hate. I really refer everybody back to listening to your Understanding Islam. It'll give you the idea of what they like. In fact, I will just say this one little thing. I think that you mentioned it. I think this was your analogy that you said they sort of see the West as like the Las Vegas, like an LDS person would see Las Vegas. Was that you that said that?
I may have said something like that.
If it wasn't you, it was I've had this, but it's like, the LDS person goes to Las Vegas and we want to go to the buffet and we want to see the shows, but we don't want to participate in all of it. So there's,
right.
There's some parts that are repulsive about it, and there's some parts that are so still attractive. It's like we're wearing the Izod shirts and we're having the Mercedes, but okay. So in that way, I want to. They don't hate us like just individually, like I hate you because of this. There's reasons why they don't like Western culture, and there's reasons why they're trying to establish certain things. But what do we take about from this that we can build some common ground on? I'm going to have a podcast called Common Ground, but how do we build common ground with our people and the way we formulate our ideas, our policies, our legislatures? How do we work with Islam? How do we work with our brothers?
Yeah, I will say that I can't count the number of conversations that I've been in where it begins with a denunciation of American foreign policy or American attitudes toward Israel. And then after that's passed, we're just friends.
Yeah,
because
right.
it's my government they're mad at, not me. Yeah. They're fine with me and with Americans in many cases. And that's just really, really common. I've had that experience really innumerable times. So there are bases on which we can build relationships. I think one is, well, hospitality. I've had people call me many times, not recently, but many times when they've wanted to know, if there's a mosque being built in my neighborhood here in California or wherever they are, should I be concerned? And my immediate response is, yes, you should be concerned that if they have an open house, you might miss the invitation. Because they'll probably have some really good food. And
they will.
A lot of really good neighbors.
Food is so good.
And unless the imam is some fire-breathing loon, which is relatively rare, you're just going to find it's a real addition to the neighborhood. There'll be a community center there and a lot of people that you will like. And they're frankly sort of like Latter-day Saints in this regard. They want you to come because they'd love you to become Muslims. We love them to come to open houses and chapels because we want people to become Latter-day Saints.
Why not?
But that's fine. I understand that, and but they'll be wonderful, friendly people, and we can often make common cause with them. This is one important thing, I think. We can make common cause with them on certain community issues, certain standards that we share in common, certain social trends that we share a common distaste for. Where the society is going downhill in certain ways. When some artworks began coming out that were really blasphemous, toward Jesus, or really blasphemous from a Catholic point of view toward the Virgin Mary, often the people that were leading the demonstrations and the protests were Muslims who were at least as offended as the Catholics and the general Christians were by those things. They were out picketing and so on. I mean, we are not opposed on everything. They venerate Jesus. They venerate Moses. They actually have a whole chapter in the Quran about Mary. And so
Samuel's one of their favorite prophets.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We have a lot in common with them, and we have a lot of values, shared values. And I think there are a lot of areas where we could work together. I know the church is working together with Islamic Relief to bring aid where necessary in a lot of areas of the world where there have been, earthquakes or the tsunami, for example, in Indonesia, in the Indian Ocean basin. When was it? Quite a few years ago. I'm getting old. These things seem like they were recent, but they're a long time ago, relatively speaking. But the church entered in there, and we didn't have the distribution network that Islamic Relief had in Indonesia, but we had things they didn't have, and so we worked together. And there are wonderful stories that have come out of this, of Latter-day Saints and Muslims working together, or Latter-day Saints offering the welfare canneries to help Muslims make food.
Oh, yeah, fantastic.
And food for Bosnia and so on. And or in one case, I know in, I think, Orange County, California, when the Muslim mosque was under construction, we allowed Muslims to hold their Friday prayers in the cultural hall of one of the stake centers there.
Oh, wow.
And they appreciate that kind of thing. And they appreciated having a worship space that gave them a flat area to pray without icons and crucifixes and all that sort of thing. So there are a lot of areas where we can work together on humanitarian projects and so on, where I just think we have a lot in common and a real desire to serve. I remember one area in Florida where the imam there was wanting to know what we could do together with what he could do with Latter-day Saints. He said, in that particular mosque, he had, I think, 87 Pakistani doctors working in that area of Florida who came to his mosque. And he said, but we're all first generation and we don't know things to do. And I said, well, we do, and so the ideal would be for us to get together and help to organize projects where they could supply that kind of manpower. And there was an effort to go ahead with that. I don't know what came of it. The local stake president was enthused, and then about a month later was called as the temple president. So I don't know if anything followed through on it or not, but I think that kind of thing is really promising. And I would just say, if you have Muslim neighbors, invite them over. If they invite you, go. We're not doing missionary work in most areas of the Islamic world, and we're being very, very careful about that. If it's against the law, we don't do it. Latter-day Saints, as some leaders of the church have said, we don't enter a country except through the front door. We don't sneak in. But we can be friendly with them. Here's an example. That very area in Florida, I spoke to a group of Latter-day Saints in the Stake Center across from the temple in Orlando, to Latter-day Saints there on Islam. Well, at the last minute, the imam of the big mosque, and it's a big mosque there down the street from the temple, decided that he wanted to attend. And he announced to his mosque people, his parishioners, if you will, he said, I'm not going to be here for the Quran class next Sunday night. I'm going to the Latter-day Saint chapel, the Mormon chapel across the street from their temple, and I'm going to attend their talk there. And if any of you want to come, please do.
Oh, that's
well,
cool.
When he arrived, it was just minutes before the thing started. And probably about 15 or 20 members of his mosque came in. Some of the Latter-day Saints, I found out later, were very nervous about this. But I loved it. I had him come up on the stand with me. And when the question and answer session started, there were some of the questions where I said, well, the imam here can answer that question at least as well as I can. And so what came out of that was a lot of people then talked with them and they were friendly. And then, about 6 months later, he called me up and wanted to know, he says, we do an annual program for the Muslims of Central Florida on Muhammad. And I wanted to know if you would be willing to be the keynote speaker. And I thought, this is astonishing, but yes, I would. And so he told me later that some members of his mosque were really worried about me.
About you, yeah.
Yeah, and he said, don't worry, when he's done, we can talk about it. Well, I tried to make sure that I didn't do anything that would offend them. And I, again, tried to emphasize we have so much in common. Yeah. And there are areas where we can work together. And so I think on a practical level, I'd say even before I preach to a Muslim, I try to make a Muslim friend.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that's that applies almost to every time.
Yeah,
it's really hard to preach to somebody if they're not disposed to want to listen to what you have to say. If they don't have respect for you,
right,
then why are you preaching to them? So you need to have an accept. That's when they went to the missionary manual back when I was a missionary. It's build relationships of trust. Well, that's the first thing you do.
Yeah,
build relationship of trust with these people.
So I'd like to see it happen. It's happening to an extent on the church-wide level. I know some of the brethren have been into Muslim countries and have built good relationships there and so on. But I'd love to see Latter-day Saints doing it in local congregations across the church where it's possible to do that. Reach out, have a joint service project with the local mosque.
Oh, I'd be all for that. I mean, I'd love to even find just a nice restaurant that's good here, that's decent here in Phoenix. Yeah, I'd be all for that kind of stuff. Kerry, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to that. Some of the, I have lots and lots of Muslim friends, and some of the areas that I found are very much common ground, conversation points that you can just talk about. If you want to talk about how to treat other people, you will find that we agree with our Muslim brothers, and you can go on for hours and hours about the right way to treat people and just agree. If you want to talk about, there might be different forms, but about the importance of being devoted to God, you will find that you can talk about that for hours. If you want to talk about being honest or helping people, that hospitality or being honest and so on. And maybe I'll just share a story real quickly, because I want our listeners to understand the goodness that, I mean, in every religion, there's someone who practices it in a way that most people in the religion don't think is the right way. And in every religion, there are people who kind of believe, but their behavior doesn't match their beliefs. That's true of anyone. But by the vast majority, Muslims live their religion in a very, very wonderful, honorable way. So I'll just share a story that highlights that. For very many years, we had a driver named Hanafi. We've actually had two drivers for our excavation named Hanafi, but this was a dear old man. And one year, one of our the people from my excavation team, as he drove us to the airport, she had an envelope with $500 in it, and she accidentally left it in the taxi. It just fell out of her pocket or her bag or something, and she left it in the taxi. Now, during that year, and this story is actually a little emotional for me. It's hard for me to tell, but poor Mr. Hanafi, a wonderful man, had a daughter who died during that year. And it was partially because they couldn't afford to get her the medical treatment that could save her. But when we came back the next year, he gave that envelope with $500 in it that had been sitting in his house for a year waiting to give back to our excavation member, who, if she had known, would have said, please use that for your daughter. But he was not going to use it for his daughter because it wasn't honest. And that's the kind of people that we're talking about. And I don't think he's exceptional in that way. We're just talking about good people who devoutedly want to live the way God wants them to live.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. People used to ask me all the time, well, don't you feel unsafe in Cairo? And the answer was no. No, I never have. I mean, I grew up near Los Angeles. There are areas of Los Angeles that I would never go. But in Cairo, I could go just about anywhere and feel perfectly safe. And
Agreed.
I heard lots of stories of people leaving something somewhere and it was still there when they came back. People hadn't stolen it, you know. There's a lot of honor there. You know, there are the occasional thieves and pickpockets, but by and large, no, I have never felt unsafe there. And because the people are basically good people, they'll go out of their way to help you.
Yeah, they will.
This is fantastic. This is kind of what I was hoping we would come to, is this kind of, and I could go on for hours more. I won't take up your time, but I hope you'll come back and visit us again on the podcast, because I've got 10,000 more questions for you for sure. And I could listen to your stories and things all day long. But I had a conversation when I was at BYU. One of my friends, also a returned missionary, she was just determined to get into politics, and she was going to change all the laws. And I said, well, what laws are you going to pass to make people be good? And she's like, well, what do you think we should do? And I'm like, I'll tell you what I think we should do, but you're not going to like it because it's not a simple answer. And she said, well, what do you think? And I said, you should encourage people to go to church, to go to temple, to go to synagogue, to go to mosque, anything of those religions that teach good things and relationships with your fellow people. Same thing after 9/11. I thought the same thing. Go out and meet your neighbors. That's the first thing you do. Don't go pass a law. Don't go look for this protest. Go meet your neighbor first. And then let's meet our world neighbors, which are these great Muslims that are out there that have very similar things to us. They have similar backgrounds. They're not that far different from us. Like Kerry said, they have great principles of honesty. A billion people out there. There's a few bad apples. There's a few bad apples everywhere. We talked about that.
Well, I'll tell you another common point is family. I find
for sure
that I have more in common with Muslims when it comes to talking about family than I do with most Americans.
Right. That's
and
true.
I'm more comfortable with my large family. I have 6 kids, right? Which is a while ago wouldn't have been seen as a large family, and now is. But when I lived in Los Angeles, so Dan and I are both fellow Bruins. But when I lived in Los Angeles and people would see that we had a large family, it was inevitable that we would receive derogatory comments.
Yeah.
But if I'm around Muslims and they see I have 6 children, they say Mabruk, which means blessed. You're blessed, right? Yeah. I am more at home in terms of family discussions with Muslims than with Americans.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah.
There's a YouTube channel out there called Serge and Rhoda in Israel. You should look this up. And Serge is an Israeli, and Rhoda, his wife, is Arab. And they go all around the Holy Land, going through the Bible stories, and then visit these places. And they're like, this is where Goliath could have stood. And listen, you can hear me speak from here. Fantastic YouTube. You should look at Serge and Rhoda in Israel.
Okay.
But especially during this last year or 2 years when they couldn't go out, Rhoda went to some of her family things and talked about families and whatever. So she's Arab, right? So she talked about some of the food they had, and they couldn't go out and visit the places that they wanted to go. They were quite locked down, but they talked about food and about the people and about their father and all these great family things. And so, yeah, that's perfect. And I kind of want to end on this, unless Kerry, you've got anything else you want to throw in here, please. I'd like to end on this sort of, tell me again, I'm going to learn this phrase, the phrase that you gave us for you're among family on flat ground. Tell me that again.
It's ahlan wa sahlan. So AHLAN, WA, and then sahlan, SAHLAN. So it rhymes a little bit. Ahlan wa sahlan. And ahl means kinfolk, family, something like that. And sahlan means level, flat. So
what is and? The what part is and, right?
Yeah. So family and flat is sort of family and level, which the only way I can understand that is to think it's a fossilized greeting, which says, you have arrived among kinfolk. It's a good campground, like Abraham and Lot begging the strangers, stay with us, partake of our hospitality.
As soon as you said that, that was like a perfect metaphor for what we're talking about here is for family, and we're family. That's what Kerry and I were talking about. This is the family. The stories in the Old Testament are about our family. This is how our family started. So you're a family, and we're on even ground, which I can think of so many great metaphors for the level ground. Of course, when you're camping, you want a level camping ground. You don't want to be sloped or uncomfortable. So it's a comfortable place.
Right.
It's a level ground, but it's also metaphorically, you think about this is a nice common ground, even ground. We're on even levels. I'm not sitting on a throne. I'm not on a pedestal. We're on even level ground. I was in Louisiana, and in New Orleans, they have places that they're like medians, and they call them neutral grounds. They're like little park areas, and they would say, "Well, meet in the neutral ground," and it's just a level, easy place. And I thought, man, what a great metaphor that you had there about the level ground. I can think of so many great ways, and I think that's a perfect metaphor for what we should be doing. And I really appreciate your knowledge and bringing this to us here on the podcast. Kerry, what do you think?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been one of the singular fun times of my life as far as studying scriptures. I've been wanting to do it since 2002. I got a copy of this from my friend Rich, who worked at Deseret Book. So if you haven't heard this, and Dr. Peterson, Dan, are you going to do another version of this Understanding Islam?
Well, you're encouraging me to do it, so maybe I will.
Okay, so I'm gonna extract a commitment out of you that you're gonna do a version. This one is still still as timeless as ever, I'm sure. And if you're not looking, I keep holding this up, and if you're not watching, if you're just listening, it's called Understanding Islam: An LDS Perspective by Daniel Peterson. And it's a 2 CD set. Is it still at Deseret Book?
It's on Deseret Book Plus. I know.
I haven't looked,
okay.
Honestly.
I listened to it last week on Deseret Book Plus.
If it's not there, we need to get it back on there, because it really is fantastic about understanding this. And I really wish you would do also a non-LDS one, not because I think the LDS one is the plus of version, but I think we did a non-LDS one so that other people would just understand a little bit about Islam, and that it's not so foreign, and we don't have to be enemies with these people. These are our brothers.
Yeah, that would be, I think, if I had to boil it down in one sentence, what I've tried to convey to Latter-day Saints and others over the years is we are not that foreign. These religions are not that different. There are differences, but it's not even like Christianity and Buddhism, which are really very, very different. But Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are cousin religions. They're what the Arabs called the Adyan Samawiya, the heavenly religions, or Adyan Ibrahimiya, the Abrahamic religions. So
right, yeah, we come from the same place, and that's what we're studying here this year in Come Follow Me, is the Old Testament, and this is our family. So anyway,
Yep.
anyway,
It's talking about cousin Ishmael and his buds.
that's right, cousin Ishmael, cousin Ishmael.
Right.
So I'm gonna adopt that too. So anyway, that's been fantastic, and I've waited. I would have never thought. Years ago, I wanted to get a hold of you and ask you a few questions, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm never gonna have an audience for this, to call up this guy out of the middle of nowhere, and just luckily knowing Kerry and the thing. So anyway, it's been a singular pleasure for me to be able to talk to you, and I hope that we get to talk again on some other things. Like you've got so many things that I want to hear about, but for now, we'll let you get on with your day, and you've got a book to put out.
I do. Well,
So
thank you.
You bet. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Kerry. Thanks for introducing us and letting us talk. And I just really appreciate the discussion here. I hope we get to do it again. And thanks again for our listeners and viewers for joining us on the Scriptures Are Real podcast. I hope you share this with your friends. I hope you get something out of it, and you can get a better understanding of how the Scriptures are real, and they are real